Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. I would like to go over a workflow for doing entertainment design entirely in Blender. I used to do sculpting in ZBrush and then retopology and so on in Blender, but I found that it's really nice to be able to do everything in one package. And the sculpting tools for Blender are definitely good enough now. Tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a freelance artist since 2017. I mainly did medical animations for companies and things like that. And then I started Blender Secrets, which was an Instagram channel where I posted the 1 minute short Blender tutorials. And I've been doing that ever since 2018. And I now have 250,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I make a living selling an ebook based on those short tutorials and some video courses as well. First of all, if you want to sculpt in Blender, there are some things that I would recommend. First of all, if you have a Wacom tablet like me, I have a Wacom Intuos Pro. I think it's already 20 years old. And it still has the original nib. It's still not worn out. And that's mainly because of the settings I use. I actually don't really touch the Wacom tablet that much. I just sort of hover over it. And what I would recommend is that you set up the preferences for every app individually. Like you can make one for Blender. And then you set the top button on the Wacom to be the right click, the lower button to be the middle click, and the nib itself to be the click. And then it's very important also that you map the Wacom tablet to the size of your screen. So also in the options, you can check the force proportions option. And that makes sure that the aspect ratio of your screen matches the part of the tablet that you use. So you will have to sacrifice probably a little bit of the space on your Wacom. But at least then when you draw a circle, it will be perfectly circular on the screen as well, instead of like an egg shape or something, which would happen if the proportions didn't match. And yeah, one of the options that I really recommend is hover click. Basically what that means is that I don't have to touch the surface of the Wacom tablet. I just sort of hover like 1 millimeter above it. And that I think is more ergonomic for my hand, and it's also better for the pen. And you don't have this constant scratching sound. It's also nice. So if you hold the lower button, you can rotate the view. So I'm not touching the tablet, just hovering above it. And if I do that and I hold Shift and I kind of pan around like this, and if I hold Control and press the lower button, I can zoom in and out. So that's how I would navigate in Blender. Now, in Blender, it's also very important that you have a way to identify flipped normals. So flipped normals are when the normal direction of a face or a polygon is flipped away from where it normally should be. And what happens then is that you get a transparent face, or some modifiers may not work correctly. And in Blender, you have the option to turn on the face orientation, which is in the overlays here. If you turn that off, you'll see that it's not visible that the normals are flipped there. And in preferences, you can set up a color for the flipped faces, and you can set the alpha value to be something other than 0, then you can see it more easily. And once you've done that, I recommend saving the startup file. So you just go to File, Defaults, Save Startup File, and then you don't have to worry about those settings anymore later. There are a bunch of add-ons that come with Blender that I would recommend using that are good for a concepting workflow. For example, Bull Tool, which you see in action here. I would recommend all of these. Previously, I would have said these are all add-ons, but since Blender 4.2, they changed it. They split it up into add-ons and extensions. But actually, it's just the same thing. If you want to search for something in add-ons, you just search it, and then when you find it, you check the checkbox. If you don't find it in add-ons, it's probably been moved to extensions. But all that means that you have to go to the extensions tab instead of the add-ons tab, search it there, and then click on install. And that's the same amount of steps, just slightly different. So these are the ones that I would recommend. And I will show you where I use those in the workflow later. So there are 3 techniques that I use to quickly concept things, especially hard surface design, because sculpting very precise angles and bevels and surfaces is not so easy, of course. Sculpting primarily is intended for organic objects. And so what you can do is you can make alpha brushes, which you can model in advance and then bake an image, a black and white or grayscale image. And then you can use that as a brush. And the way you do that is you just model something very quickly. For example, here I use another Boolean cutter with the bool tool. And yeah, if you look at it through the camera, well, I don't have a camera set up for that, but if I show you the material view without overlays, you can see that it has a material which gives it a grayscale appearance. And if I show that to you in the shader editor, you'll see that basically what it does is it separates the X, Y, and Z direction and only shows the Z direction, and it shows it as a gradient from black to white, where white is up and black is down. And if you render this as a texture, you can use that texture as a brush, and then you can just sculpt this on any surface. Similarly, I use vector displacement brushes. The difference between alphas and vector displacement brushes is that vector displacement brushes, or VDMs, they can have undercuts. Like these are undercuts. Normally with an alpha brush, you will project from the top. So this kind of area is invisible from the render. But with the VDMs, you can render that, because VDMs are based on UVs. And basically the way you make this is, let me just quickly show you. If I add a grid here, let's say I extrude something, and extrude this, whatever. Let's say I want to turn this into a brush. So because there are undercuts, I would choose VDMs. And the way you can make this flat, because with VDMs, you need to UV unwrap the model when it's completely flat. So it needs to be projected from the top. And yeah, if I UV unwrap this now, let me show you. Then there are a lot of things that are overlapping, so I won't be able to really UV unwrap this correctly. But in sculpt mode, there's a tool called the, let me see, where is it? Edit face set. Yeah, so the edit face set tool. Let me just turn on the wireframe so you can see what it does. If I choose the fair positions option and I click on this, then you see that it's been completely flattened. But the geometry is still there. So if I unwrap this now, then you can see that the UV map actually has all that geometry. And it's a bit a convoluted workflow, and I can't show you everything real quick, but basically how that works then is that you create a shape key, so that once you've UV unwrap this, you can get its shape back. And if you use a VDM baking material, then you get something like this. And if I now bake this to a VDM texture, then I can use that as a brush as well. This is, it takes about 20 minutes to really fully explain that workflow, but this is the gist of it. I just quickly want to show you what is possible and which tricks I use to sculpt. Well, let me just show you how these VDMs work. So I have a bunch of VDM brushes here, and I can just put them on a surface. So you see there's some resolution missing, and I can subdivide this multi-res modifier, and then I can get more detail out of that VDM brush. So you see now the detail is coming back. And of course, this is a very quick way to add some detail. But of course, you could also just add separate objects like greebles for this. Finally, what I want to show you is the tiling displacement map. So if you add a, let me see. If you add a texture, so what I've done now is I've added a texture map, which is a tiling, seamlessly tiling displacement map that I've made. And I've added some subdivisions so that there's enough resolution for using it. And this is the displacement texture. And there's a mirror on it to make sure that it's mirrored on the x-axis. And I'm using an empty, I think, which one is it? Let me see if I got the right one. Yeah. So by moving this empty, I can find a part of the tiling texture that I like. So this is a really fast way to add some detail. Let's say, for example, I like this. If I now want to sculpt on this, I will have to apply all these modifiers. So I just go to Control A and Visual Geometry to Mesh. That applies every modifier. So now I have this. And actually, one more thing I want to show you before I do that is if I say want to delete this little part here, of course I can delete that in sculpt mode, but another thing I can do is I can add a vertex group. Let me just add everything to it in edit mode. And then I add that group in the modifier. And if I go to weight paint now, I can paint that away. Actually, let me just show you that if I turn off overlays. So I just use the draw tool in weight paint mode, and then I can just paint away the parts of the displacement that I don't like. Example, I could just get rid of this if I don't like it. Right. And all that's really doing is it's just adding, painting a vertex group that is being used by that modifier. So then if I want to sculpt on that, I can press Control A and choose Visual Geometry to Mesh. And then in sculpt mode, yeah, I can just paint more on this. So if you want to know how I make this kind of tiling displacement map, it's very similar to the alpha texture that we looked at before, except it's just bigger. So it's just a plane filled with objects, and it has that same material as the alpha, as the model that I used to make an alpha brush. It goes from black to white to show the height. And I'm also just using Boolean cutters, because you don't need to worry about the geometry since it's just going to be baked into an image. So you can see I'm just using Boolean cutters here. It is important that everything tapers slightly to avoid undercuts. So it has to go slightly like this. You cannot have something go like this. So when it comes to starting to sculpt, I like to use this kind of base mesh. This is one that you can download for free on the Blender demo scenes page. They have full body, hands, face, all kinds of primitive base meshes. And it's just a little bit easier than starting from a blank canvas. So what I do is I create a blank grease pencil object. Let me just make sure that I'm in the right collection. Okay. I add a mirror modifier to it so that when I draw on one side, it's also shown on the other side. And I set it to in front. So let me just show you where I find that. By setting it to in front, it's always visible even if it's behind the base mesh. So then what I can do is I can go to draw mode and I can start to draw. And then using the base mesh, I try to come up with some kind of interesting outline. And this outline will just then guide how I deform the mesh. So after a while, you get something like this. This is a sketch I made earlier. And then what we can do is we can start to refine this base mesh. So what I do is I go to sculpt mode. And let me just get the tools there. Oh, wait a second, I have the grease pencil object selected. So I need to select this base mesh, go to sculpt mode, and then you can use, for example, the grab brush. The grab brush is good for quickly changing the topology. But I think I will quickly remesh this. So what I will do is I'll press R, choose a voxel size, and then press Ctrl R. And so now this is easier to work with. So I can use the grab brush and start deforming this shape. However, some things we have to pay attention to is the symmetry. So I forgot to turn on symmetry. And this is something you need to turn on for every object. And yeah, holding shift, you can smooth. And I will recommend using the inflate brush, the grab brush, and the snake hook brush. And one more option that I would sometimes use is grab silhouette, because if you don't use that, if I grab here, for example, and we look at that from the top, well, in this case, it did a good job, but sometimes you will only end up grabbing one side of the mesh. And in that case, it can be useful to check the grab silhouette box. And snake hook is a little bit more aggressive than the grab brush. So if you need to deform something in a slightly more extreme way, then the snake hook can be useful. Well, you can always remesh again, and after a while you'll get something like this. And once you have something like this, you can start sculpting really. And I recommend using the Draw Sharp brush and the Clay Strips brush. So Draw Sharp is really good for. Let me make sure I've selected this object. With Alt Q, you can select objects in sculpt mode. So I can start to search for some shapes by using these two brushes. And I might have to just increase the resolution a little bit by voxel remeshing. If you hold Control, you take away volume, and Shift, you smooth out, and with the Clay Strips brush, you can easily add volume. So another very useful brush is the Scrape brush, especially with hard surface work, because you can quickly simplify areas. I know this looks really terrible right now, but trust me, it'll be fine. You can always remesh. Right now, we're not worried about the underlying topology, any of that stuff. This is just going to be a guide for later modeling. And for whatever reason, this is not mirroring. Let me check if I can see why that is. I just quickly switch to edit mode. The origin seems to be in the right place. It seems that the scale and the rotation are off. That's something that can often mess up Blender. If something like that happens, what you can do is you can go to go to Edit Mode, select all by pressing A, and then you can go to Mesh, and let me see, where is it? Symmetrize here. And then you can choose a direction. In this case, it's from +X to -X. So now everything has been mirrored. And in fact, I've added that to my quick favorites. So in edit mode, I can always symmetrize real quick. Now, after a while, you'll get something maybe like this. This is something I sculpted earlier. You can see it's very, very lumpy and crude. Doesn't look very promising yet, but yeah, you just need to start somewhere and create something that you can then find inspiration from later on. Now, if we're going to be sculpting this, I would use the Scrape brush. Let me just quickly close these windows here. So in sculpt mode, you have to select an object to be able to go to sculpt mode. But I would use these 4 brushes at this stage. So scrape brush is a really fun brush because you can quickly start getting some kind of hard surface look. And I didn't really do anything to the settings of the brush. I'm just using it in its default settings. And it works a little bit differently than the similar brush in ZBrush. So maybe if you're coming from ZBrush, it takes a minute to get used to it. The one in ZBrush is better, I will say. But once you get used to this, you can definitely work with it. And the benefit of using Blender is that you can, you have all these other tools at your fingertips, like the remeshing and retopology and modeling. So yeah, use also Draw Sharp. Can set slightly smaller radius. If you want, you can also use the stabilize stroke here. That way you can, for example, draw these distinctions between different objects a little bit more sharply. And yeah, if you're doing something like, for example, you want to script here, but you don't want to influence this part here, you can always use the mask. Strength is set quite high now. So we can mask this to protect it. And then when we use the scrape brush here, it doesn't affect those parts that are masked. And of course, you can also press Ctrl I to invert, and then use that to your advantage as well. And Alt M to unmask everything. So then finally, maybe we end up with something like this, which I sculpted earlier. So at this point, I recommend don't spend too much time sculpting, but instead try to use retopology modeling techniques to recreate these shapes so that you can make them really perfect. And then you can continue sculpting on them. And let me just turn these off. So some tools for retopology in Blender. Well, the easiest way to start retopologizing is to just add a plane and then collapse it to one vertex. Let me just turn this off. Set it to in front so you can always see what you're doing. And then you can just extrude. And you can start to recreate the shape that you sculpted. Now, in this case, it's not sticking to the surface. And for that, I need to turn on snapping and snapping to face. Specifically, maybe face project. And if I just press G to move, it will snap now. So I can keep extruding and moving these things. And of course, you can mirror this and stuff. Now, there is a new option in Blender 4.2, and I'll show you what it does. So if I select all of these and I want to extrude it, and it's still snapping to the surface, what happens, because I did it from another angle, is it's got quite bad here. So let me just undo that. And if I choose face nearest instead of face project, what happens is it tries to do a much better job of placing those vertices. So then I can just rearrange this a little bit. It doesn't always work perfectly, so I recommend you still switch between these two options as you deem necessary. By pressing F, I can just fill this face here. And if I add a subdiv modifier to this now, let me just isolate it for a moment. You'll see that it's very smooth like this. But if I select this edge and press Shift E and 1 to crease it, and increase the subdivs, then you get this very nice sharp piece, right? Of course, you only need to model one side. You can add a mirror modifier. Let me see. I'll drag it to the top. And yeah, we can, as the mirror object, use the sculpt. It's important that backface culling is on, otherwise you will see the object through everything. That can be confusing, so definitely check this box. And yeah, you can just do this manually like this, or you can use the P-Surfaces add-on. So this is an add-on that I think it's an extension now, but it also comes with Blender by default. And to use it in object mode, you just select an object, and then you click on Initialize. And then you just draw the geometry like this. And you can choose here how much edge loops you want. I'm just going to keep it as simple as possible. And then click on Add Surface. And well, you can't see it right now because it's not in front, but like now you can see that it actually created some geometry, right? And of course you can still manually add more to that. And you might think, oh, it's strange that I'm using a triangle here, because triangles and n-gons are not good, of course. But actually, if you let me just apply this. If you add a subdiv modifier, and let me just crease these edges. By creasing edges with Shift E and 1, you can kind of keep the shape. Actually, let me just crease this as well. Maybe this one as well. And when you apply a subdiv modifier, it actually turns everything into quads. So as you can see now, the triangle here has become 3 quads, in fact. And anyway, this is how you can quickly retopo the whole thing. And then you will end up, hopefully, with something like this. Let me just remove that. So now we have all these shells, and they all have mirror modifiers and so on. And it's all very simple geometry. And what we want to do is we want to just eliminate these gaps, right? And so, yeah, we can, let's turn off snapping. But we can just move this inside, scale it up, and yeah, generally just try and make these things overlap. Of course, you can also extrude some more. And you can always crease more edges with Shift E and 1. Right? And after a while, you will get something like this, where all these gaps have been closed. And it's also an opportunity to think a bit more about the shape. I mean, you don't have to slavishly follow the sculpt. You can try to simplify parts, or you can make things fit a little bit better. Like, for example, you can turn on the proportional editing, and then you can try to improve the shape and make things match so that they work together better. And now that we have this, we can start to play with, for example, our tiling displacement map. So, for example, if I select this, and let me just collapse these modifiers. And if I add a displace modifier now, and don't worry about this, we'll just click on new here. And then click on this button for the texture tab. And now I can open one of those tiling displacement maps. So I don't know, this one, for example. So these, I don't know if you can tell, but these are the black and white or grayscale seamlessly tiling displacement maps. So if I open that and then go back to my modifier here, I have to make sure that it's set to bisect, yeah. And let me see, as the object coordinates here, I'm going to add an empty. So I can use any shape I want, and if you want, you can make an empty smaller with this. And I'll use that empty for the coordinates. Now this object, I don't know why it's not mirroring correctly, but let's see if I just set the cursor back to the world origin, add an empty, and then use that as the mirror object. Maybe I need to, yes, there's some rotation. So if I apply the rotation, no. Okay, I realized what it is. I need to place the mirror modifier underneath the displace modifier. And to solve this gap, I can just move these a bit further. And I can reduce the strength of this. And maybe add one more subdivision. So the more subdivisions you add, the more of the resolution you get from the displacement map. So now I can just move this, and I can get some interesting detail from that. Let me just reduce it a bit further. So I can move this on the x-axis. What I can also do is I can rotate it 90 degrees and see what that does. And I can also scale up and scale down. For example, this is pretty interesting. And after a while, what you get is maybe something like this. Let me just turn off those shadows. Those are a bit ugly. So these objects now all have this tiling displacement map. You can see if I turn it off, then it doesn't have that. And yeah, by moving these empties, you can create different kinds of detail really quickly. I think that's pretty cool. It certainly would take a long time to sculpt these details. This one also, this is not seamlessly tiling, but it tiles in one direction. These cables. Let me see, I don't know which empty that is. This one. And then finally, yeah, what you have to do is you have to apply all this. Now, one thing you can do is you can press Ctrl A and Visual Geometry to mesh. But then what you get is you still have this big empty gap, and that will be a problem when we are going to sculpt. So instead, what I'm going to do, let me just undo, or well, I can just show it with something else, is if I just collapse all of these, I can add a remesh modifier. And it's underneath everything, and I'll set it to smooth, and then change the octave depth to something like 9. Maybe 10 would be even better, but that will be more difficult for the computer. And if we isolate it now, you'll see that it's actually closed. It doesn't look good, of course. This is pretty crappy, but it just matters that it's a watertight, closed mesh. And now if I apply Visual Geometry to mesh, so we just we still have the same, but now we can actually sculpt on this. So now, for example, I can scrape this and smoothen it out. Yeah, and I can simplify this if I want. I'm just using my mouse right now. I sometimes just forget to use the Wacom tablet, but you get the idea. So that's great. And on to the next step. One more add-on that I want to show you is the copy attributes add-on. This is very convenient if you want to copy just one modifier to all the other objects. For example, here on this object, let's say I have this remesh modifier, and I want to copy that to all of the other objects. But I don't want to copy, for example, its displace modifier. So what I will do is I will select every object that I want to copy that modifier to. And then holding Shift, I will select the object that already has the modifier. And then I just press Ctrl C, copy selected modifiers, and then choose the remesh one and click OK. And then you have to be patient for a bit. Don't forget, now we're working with millions of polygons, so that can already get a little bit slower. Okay, so now it's copied that. Let's check. Okay, so now if we check these objects, they all have the remesh modifier at the end. And so then what we do is just select them all and press Ctrl A and Visual Geometry to mesh. Okay, so now these are all watertight objects. So with everything being remeshed, one thing I would recommend is to set the origin of all these objects to the 3D cursor. Actually, let me set the 3D cursor to the world center first. And apply also the rotation and scale of everything. And actually you can just get rid of this. That way we avoid issues when we are going to sculpt. And also, yeah, if you're going to sculpt mode, don't forget that you have to turn on symmetry for every object. And to select an object, just press Alt-Q while hovering over it. But as you can see, like I have symmetry turned on for this object, but not for that one. Also not for that one. It will remember it on a per object basis. But that's kind of an annoying feature, but unfortunately that's just something you have to deal with. And yeah, then you can just start refining it. And I would use the grab brush, the scrape brush, really just anything that makes sense. Where is it? I've already got it selected. So yeah, I can start to try to make this look a bit better, because it is a bit lumpy. Smooth brush is also a great tool. You just hold shift to smooth. One thing you can also do, if you want to build up, like let's say I want to have a bit more of a ridge here. One thing you can do is you can use the draw brush or the draw sharp brush. Normally draw sharp will, let me set it a bit stronger, maybe 1.5 or something. I didn't select it for some reason. Let me just turn off the stabilization. So normally draw sharp will create a indentation like this. But actually it can also, if you hold Control, it will invert it and it will create a ridge like this. And then you can use clay strips to fill in the sides. Just to build that up, and then you can scrape that. No, scrape is set very high. Well, anyway, that's a way that you can create some kind of a ridge there. Just fill this up a bit more. And yeah, even though it's not perfect, just keep in mind that we are creating a concept here. We're not creating a movie or game ready model. So it's actually fine if it's a bit messy. It's just to communicate an idea. And you or somebody else will later retopologize it to make it really perfect, right? The grab brush can also be good. Like for example, here I've got some stuff sticking out. I can just quickly pull that down. Oops, I think I still have grab silhouette turned on. So I can pull that down where I don't want it. Like for example here, this I want to hide that. Or here, this one I want to hide in this part. So the grab brush is great for that. Yep. And yeah, finally you will get something like this. So here I've spent a little bit more time refining everything with the grab and the scrape brush and the smooth brush. Yeah, you can spend as much time as you want on that, of course. But just keep in mind that if you're going to retopologize later, that you don't really need to spend that much time now making it perfect. Now, what I personally think is a really fun part of this is using the alphas and VDMs that we discussed in the beginning. So yeah, you can just... By the way, if you make an alpha brush, you can add your own custom thumbnail to it. So I have all these custom thumbnails, and just that helps me select it much faster, of course. So I will just choose something, and let's say I want to put that here. Oops. And maybe I want to place one here in the middle. In that case, I want to turn off symmetry, of course. So the keyboard shortcuts for sculpting with a brush is F is the radius, Shift F is the strength. So if I set the strength really low, I'll get a really weak result. If I set it to 1, I will get the full alpha. And Control F is to rotate the brush, which in this case doesn't really make any difference. So this is some kind of camera or something. And what's interesting is you can also combine alphas. So let's say I want to add this one on top of that. Then I can do that like this. Actually, this one is an inverted one, so I need to hold Control. That. And yeah, if I use, for example, one of these screw-looking ones, and then I press Control F to rotate, then you can see that it's rotated. Something like that. And if it bothers you that you can kind of see the resolution of the sculpt here, you can set it to shade smooth. So you can see here the individual polygons. But if I right click and choose shade smooth, then it already looks a lot better. Or shade auto smooth. I think shade smooth is fine like this. And by the way, if you're wondering about like the highlights and the shadows, that's actually just in the viewport shading options here. So cavity is turned on and it's set to both, and you can change how that looks exactly. I like to use this because yeah, it's much easier to see what you're doing than if you turn it off. And also a matte cap helps a lot. Like normally it would, by default, it would look like this. So I think this makes it look a lot more interesting. And you can change the matte cap every now and then to make sure your eyes don't get bored, you know. And of course, we also have the VDMs. We can see if we can use a VDM to give him some rabbit ears or something. Let me see. Ooh. So the resolution is too low. Let me add a multi-res modifier and subdivide it a couple of times. Maybe one more time. Something like this, for example. Yeah, and yeah, once you've had some fun with these VDMs, after a while you'll get maybe something like this. So these panel cuts, for example, these are also just alphas. Let me show you. So these are these alphas. So you can place them like this. And you can rotate. And one thing, small tip is if you press and you want to place an alpha and you decide you don't want it, instead of undoing, it's usually faster to, while you still have the tool going, to press escape. Then it doesn't need to undo anything, and it's generally a lot faster. And yeah, one more thing I can probably do now is add some more panel lines. So let me see if I just choose the normal draw tool. Or actually, if I use draw sharp, that can I can use that to draw panel lines. But of course, as you can see, now I'm just using a mouse, but even with a Wacom pen, it's difficult to really draw that perfectly. So one thing you can do is turn on stabilize stroke. And then you can just draw that much better. And another thing you can do is if you press Alt-E, you get this stroke method menu. And normally it's by default set to dots. But if you choose a line, for example, then you can draw very perfect lines like this. And we can set the, we can set it's a bit higher, by the way. So, well, maybe not that high. Or maybe we should have a smaller radius. So now we can draw very perfect panel lines. And if you want, there's also the curve option. Let me see. The way that works is you can hold Control and right click and then set some points. And you can even curve those points. And then when you press enter, it will use the tool. And then if you want to get rid of the curve, you just double press A and delete. And if you want to know yet another way to draw panel cuts, you can also use a mask. And you can draw mask lines like this. And then what you can do is press Ctrl I, and you can use the mesh filter set to inflate, and then hold Shift for more control and drag the mouse to the left. And then press Alt-M to unmask. So that's a bunch of ways to do panel cuts real quick. And in the end, yeah, you can maybe end up with something like this. And at this stage, I would recommend, yeah, when you're happy with it, to do another pass of retopology. And this time you can, yeah, retopologize all these individual parts very precisely and make them really mechanical looking and human-made looking. And I think this is a very fast way to get to a hard surface concept. Like if I had just started doing traditional box modeling, I don't think I would have gotten to this result so quickly. And I think using the tiling displacement maps and the alphas and the VDMs makes it more fun, makes it more creative, and you can have some happy accidents, find some shapes that you would not normally find. So yeah, that's my current workflow for entertainment design entirely in Blender. I think it's fun to experiment, especially with those tiling displacement maps, and quickly arrive at some shapes that you would not normally think of, sometimes by having a happy accident. Yeah, I think if you just use traditional box modeling, probably you will not get to this kind of shape as quickly, unless you use blueprints or have a very elaborate concept art in 2D made in advance that you can base it off. But with this workflow, you can kind of maybe skip that part or just make a really rough concept first and fully flesh it out in sculpting and retopology techniques. Yeah, but I'm curious to find out what you guys think, and I hope you found this interesting. And yeah, thanks for watching.